All right, so hello and welcome to the ABCs of Pollinators, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Jackson County Master Gardeners. I am Spencer. I am an adult services librarian here at Jackson County Library Services in Medford. Reminder for everyone, I know we kind of already went over this, but just to keep your microphone muted to avoid distractions for our presenter. If you have questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen and we will go over them at the end. If it's a question about going through a slide too quickly or being a little loud or not loud enough, something like that, we'll address it right away. Anything else we'll address at the end, and I can read for Christina to answer. Before we get started, I do want to share the land acknowledgement, which is that the Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lakawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. Lastly, I do want to share that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. We always say that I don't think there's going to be anything that controversial here, but you never know. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christina. If you have questions, use the chat and we will have some time to check in and have a little conversation at the end, hopefully as well.
Great. Thank you, Spencer, and thank you, Colette, for the invitation. I hope y'all can hear me fine. I'm at the office where I work a lot, and we have a rather janky HVAC system, so hopefully the noise isn't bothering you like it is me. Thanks for inviting me and having this interest on this particular topic. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I hope you find it informational and inspiring. We're going to talk about all sorts of pollinators, not just bees. And I am showing you an excerpt here of a poster that you'll get to see in its entirety, but just showing you, since have A, B, C's, I wanted to start off with a poster of bees, but there's so many more to pollinators than just bees. So I hope we can go through that and you'll find that of interest. So I moved here from Georgia in 2012, and I've lived in Georgia for about 45 years, so that's pretty much what I knew. And as I became more part of this place, I don't know how long y'all have lived here, so maybe you find that, this is a normal place to be. But coming from Georgia to Oregon is quite a shift. I just met somebody recently from Florida to Oregon. That's even a bigger shift. And one of the things that's just amazing to me about Oregon is the amazing diversity that's here compared to Georgia. And this is one of the maps that you can find about the ecoregions, the diversity of this Southern Oregon region. This came from K.S. Wild, and I thought this was a great quote to show you, because if you're not familiar with how diverse we are, then I invite you to look into this, and this is going to sort of be underlying the entire presentation. So I just want you to kind of keep this thought in your mind about the amazing place that we live. The mountains and rivers that define this region are some of the most spectacular in America. The flora and fauna are absolutely unparalleled. And then just to add into that, Oregon has over 3,600 species of native plants. That goes from trees to bulbs to shrubs to grasses to flowering plants. So we're quite diverse, not quite as much as California perhaps, but we're doing pretty good. So I just want you to think about that as we go through the presentation, and then maybe to ask the question, does it have to be out there? Do you have to go hiking to see these plants and these trees? Do you have to go, to the wild coast and see these plants? What about the flora? Sorry, what about the fauna? Like, do you have to go out there to see that particular pollinator? So just think about that as we go through it as well. So this is what we're going to talk about today. What is a pollinator garden? Why pollinators? What are the threats and solutions? We'll have time, I think, at the end for questions and answers. Um, on screen if you want to do that. But if, like Spencer said, anytime you want to put a question in the chat, feel free to do that. So here's your chance to answer a question, maybe in the chat. And although I'm fine if you want to open up your mic and say, does anybody know what kind of flower this is, the species of flower, and or what insect we're seeing? If you want to put it in the chat or just say, that's fine too. No takers? Nobody's going to guess? All right. So this is an Oregon sunshine, a number of flowers. I took this photo, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is a sweat bee. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure based on what it looks like, based on this angle and the size and so forth, I'm going to say it's a sweat bee, which is a pretty common bee, actually, once you start looking. Oh, let me just also say that we're not going to go in this order. This is just what we're going to talk about. So just be prepared that we will touch on all that, but not necessarily in that order, because I want to first ask you, well, what is an insect? And for those of you that have recently taken biology, then you might hopefully remember this, that there are millions of them in the world. According to the scientists, or maybe it was just Google, we have 1 million described species, and maybe there's 5 to 10 million species of insects, just general insects. 3/4 of all animal species, almost 2/3 of all life on Earth. And I was doing a little more research on this, and I thought, well, what is the importance of insects? Obviously, things eat them. So I did a little work. And according to some site I went to, reputable site, insects feed about 6,000 species of birds around the world, 350 species of mammals, and yes, humans too. So if you want this presentation, you can click on this link here. 2,000 species of insects are consumed by humans around the world. Not me so much, but I believe there is lots of direction going where insects are going to be feeding humans. And then obviously fish species are big consumers of insects. I'll just enter that person. And then on the right, you can see a chart of some of the numbers, and these are thousands. So like there are 10,000 species of ants worldwide. This is not the number of ants. This is the number of species of ants. So this tells you, this is huge. Bees, there's 20,000 species worldwide, about 700 in Oregon. Flies, 110,000. Moths, 160,000. The ones in red are considered pollinators, and the ones that are bold are like primary pollinators. And we'll talk about the moths in a second, because you're probably going, moths? What do you mean moths? So just hang on and we'll talk about that. And then hummingbirds are also pollinators, but they're not an insect, so I didn't include them. So speaking of insects, some of us are old enough to remember this was a common occurrence, and now it's pretty much only if you go to Klamath. So why would that be? Why would we have so many fewer insects when we travel around? I mean, no matter where you go, you come back with a windshield that looks like this anymore. And so I'm going to suggest to you that if you look past these insects here, you might think, I'm going to imagine, I have no idea where this photo was taken. I just grabbed it off the internet. But I'm going to imagine that's like a farmhouse, maybe an organic farm, and they don't use pesticides, and they have lots of plants and so forth and so on. So there's lots of insects in that part of this country, wherever it was taken. And then since most of us see this picture, why, right? Well, I do appreciate being able to go down the freeway and not, having my windshield be completely covered. But if you look at why this is, there's lots of grass, mowed very short. This picture is actually not even what you see here in Oregon. A lot of times you can tell it's been sprayed on the roadside to keep back the weeds that are going to be growing up. It's only conifers, they're way far back. And then there must be a good number of insecticides being sprayed because there are no insects. So, and then I just want you to ask yourself how many miles of freeways and byways and so forth there are in the country. And then that's a lot of no insects anymore. Why would that be? Well, there's lots of reasons. So, especially in the urban environment, we have a lot of non-native species, both plants and insects. I think most of you are familiar with the non-native Himalayan blackberry, just as one species that gobbles things up. Insects, we're having a pretty bad problem now with borer beetles and other insects are impacting our native species. Food desert is another word for a lawn. This is a pretty picture of a suburbia house, and there's not really much there for pollinators. I think this is a crepe myrtle, which is from Georgia, by the way. Or not from Georgia, but grown a lot in Georgia. It's a very common plant in Georgia, so it seems like it's from Georgia. And so honeybees appreciate that, maybe some bumblebees. It's not going to do too much else, and I'll talk about that. Fire obviously is a big decider of what the kind of environment we live in. Pesticides, I mentioned, disappearing habitat, how many more houses are being built, how many more roads are being built, how many more shopping centers, etc. Mismatch of flowering times as climate change continues to accelerate. Flowers are going to be blooming earlier, but that's not necessarily when the insect is supposed to be coming out. And so what if that flower that it's expecting isn't there anymore? And that's going to have an impact on both the number of flowers and the number of insects because they both depend on each other, which we'll talk about in a minute. And light pollution, even for moths, is impactful because if there's a lot of lights in the landscape, then the moths get distracted and they're not going to be doing the work that they're supposed to be doing of pollination. So this is a very cluttered slide. It's pretty until you start reading about it. This is an excerpt out of article from PNAS, which I never can remember what it stands for, but it's a professional scientific journal. And what they're doing is talking about the global threats to insects, and they have 12 cuts, is what they're calling it, death by 1,000 cuts. And there's this, I think, impactful quote here that the incremental loss of populations due to human activities go unnoticed over the decades. For those of you that have lived here a long time, you can probably think back and remember the monarchs were a relatively common occurrence. I never had the pleasure of seeing that. I moved here in 2012. But you don't really think about it over time that you saw, less and less. What happens, this is happening all over the world. And so I looked at this lovely spread in the magazine and I thought to myself, well, if we had a pollinator garden, if more people had pollinator gardens, a native plant pollinator garden, I wonder if we could help offset some of these things. So this is just me talking. I didn't talk to a scientist or anything. But if we had less lawns and more native plant gardens, then we would have less nitrification. We wouldn't be using fertilizers and gasoline, and things like that. Maybe droughts wouldn't bother us as much because we'd be growing native plants that can handle that. Not all can. There's a lot of native plants that need to be in riparian areas. But on the other hand, there's a lot that can handle less and less water. If we had urbanization happening, but we were helping to offset that with native plants, we weren't bringing in as many non-native plants. And obviously, we wouldn't be using insecticides if we were wanting to have pollinators. But then I thought to myself, well, I think there's something missing. So if anybody wants to chime in and say what they think number 13 is before I go to the next slide. All right. I have a feeling, I don't know how many of you would get it, so I'll just tell you the answer. So I don't know why and how pollinators are important. And so that's education again. If you don't know, then you don't know that you don't know, right? So I think that's number 13 is another reason that we have the problems that we do regarding pollinators and decline of species and so forth. So something that's important in the global aspect of it all is that 90% of all flowering plant species require pollination from a mammal, a bird, or an insect. And a lot of times people think, well, it's just vegetarians that are really concerned about it. But that is true. Most of us eat, lettuce. Even lettuce seed has to be pollinated. And so if you like lettuce, then you should thank a pollinator, in addition to a squash or a tomato. But even meat or milk consumers would like to know about pollinators because the healthy cows that are often fed alfalfa, and alfalfa is a pollinated crop. So even the meat and the milk. And then seeds, as I mentioned, the lettuce seed, but we also eat seeds. This is tarweed. This is one of my favorite plants. Notice it does have weed in the name, which, as you should believe it, all these are tarweeds behind this one flower. These are probably tarweeds in the background. And the native bees adore this flower. And it changes, it morphs, if you will, into a seed head. So each one of these little brown spots are seeds. They look kind of like little small sunflower seeds. And this was an important food source for the native peoples who lived here. They would do a slow burn, and then they would knock off the seeds into a basket and then grind them up, and then have that as part of their food over the fall and winter. So you're thinking about it just from a human-centric standpoint. Pollinators are important for our food source. You've probably heard the phrase 1 out of 3 bites of food, and I'm just going to suggest that maybe it's 2 bites, especially if you eat a lot of vegetables and fruits. So here's just some of them that people enjoy, including coffee. And it's not just the food. We also have fiber, like maybe some of you are wearing blue jeans made out of cotton. Medicines, I often take echinacea when I'm not feeling well. And then, of course, they give us beauty. They themselves are beautiful, and then they give us things that are beautiful, the flowers and the trees. So what is pollination? So I've got 3 diagrams here. And if you remember again back into your biology days, then pollination is simply the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same or different flower of the same species. So, you're not really going to pollinate an apple with a squash or anything like that. So it's generally the same species. This is another photo here this is a portulaca flower, the reproductive parts of a portulaca flower, I believe. So you can see the beautiful pollen there, right there on the anthers. And what needs to happen is that the pollen from this flower would need to get up to the stigma of another flower. So here you can see the pollen grains. And then what happens is it somehow sends a tendril, that the pollen becomes active, sends a tendril down, and it pollinates the seeds, fertilizes the seeds. It's basically plant sex. And then the seed starts to grow, and it becomes a fruit or a seed, depending on what the species is. So the pollen has to happen or the transfer of the pollen has to happen, like I said, either from wind. A lot of our trees are wind pollinated. Corn is often wind pollinated. People who grow tomatoes or squash in greenhouses where there's not a lot of pollinators coming in often have to hand pollinate. But insects are the best and the busiest. And this is a picture of a bumblebee on maybe a chive flower. I can't really quite tell, looking like it's doing some good pollination work. So this is what we want to have happen. And if we take ourselves out for just a second from the food portion of the calculation, then we also have the pollinators helping our other species in the world. They're pollinating the trees and the shrubs that stay up on the mountainside to keep the soil there. They're cleaning our water. They're helping to sequester carbon. They're creating the beautiful wildflowers when you go on a hike. And something that I'll touch on again is they're obviously providing food for other creatures. The birds are a great example. Baby birds need to eat caterpillars. And if you don't have caterpillars, you're not going to have baby birds. If you don't have native plants, you're not going to have caterpillars. I'll talk more about that as well. So this is a sad quote here. Bird populations have decreased by more than 30% in the US and Canada since 1970. I don't know if it's getting better now that more people are growing native plants. I certainly hope so. The more native plants in the landscape for the caterpillars and the birds, the better. So when we think of pollinators, a lot of times people think of bees. And bees are the best pollinator. They're hairy, there's a lot of them, they move around, they really get into the flower like you saw in that other photo. But most people think of honeybee. So this is the European honeybee. And this is the only bee, I wanted to back up for 1 second here. The honeybee is the only bee that is fully social, meaning that they're active all the time. Even in the winter time, you just may not see them in the landscape, but they're in the hive. The queen can lay 2,000 eggs a day, maybe up to 200,000 in a year. They live in a hive, as I said. They're not dormant in the winter. They can fly 6 miles for food. Hopefully they don't have to do that. And just as another point for those of you who have not heard of this before, one honeybee, the worker bee, not the queen, will live about 6 weeks. And in that time, she will collect enough honey to create 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. So when you think about the honey that you're eating on your toast, think about how much work that honeybee did. But there are more bees, even though this is the photo that was on the library advertisement for this particular class. This is the honeybee again. There's more than one species of bees, and I've already referenced it. We'll talk about that in a second, but before I move off of this slide, I just wanted to show you this quote from Jim Kane, a USDA entomologist. And this, I found this in another presentation. I thought it was so meaningful. And he said, he's an entomologist, he said that every 100 hives removes pollen and nectar enough from the landscape to produce 10 million native bees. So if you think about that, and then you think about these statistics that I just showed you, how many bees, how many eggs a honeybee can lay, and then think about how many native bee species we have and what their life cycles are like. So according to the scientists, there are about 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and about 4,000 of those reside in North America. That includes, the entire continent. And thanks to the OSU Oregon Bee Project, we now know that there's over 700 species native to Oregon. When I first got into this business, it was just over 500, and now it's over 700. So they've been doing some really good work getting out into all the different bioregions of the state and finding lots of bees that we didn't even know we had a couple of years ago. And the native bees are different than the honeybees. The honeybees, of course, came over from Europe in the 1600s on ships, if you can believe it. And they came over because the European settlers used them. They're European honeybees, they're native to Europe. And the European honeybee was used in crop production and also for the honey, of course, and for maybe the propolis and some of the other benefits of honeybees. But bringing them to this country when we already had 4,000 species could be problematic. And especially when you start looking at the difference in their life cycles versus the honeybees. Most of them live about 6 weeks. There are a few exceptions. Most of them lay about 30 eggs in that life cycle of a year. There are exceptions, the bumblebee being the primary one. Most are solitary. They live by themselves, not in a hive. They barely have a nest. And some of them, such as the mason bee, can only travel a short distance, like 200 feet compared to 6 miles for the honeybee. So this means that this mason bee needs a lot of food within that short distance of time or space. So not all places have enough to feed a mason bee family. This is a few of the 4,000 species on this particular poster. This is from Bees in Your Backyard. Actually a really great poster. So we need these native bees in our landscape, of course, because of the native trees and the shrubs that they evolved with over the millennia. But they also are very great pollinators of many of our crops. I don't have a slide for this. I should have added it, but how much better mason bees are pollinating fruit trees versus the honeybees. And so then the question is, why are there so many of them? Here are just a few different species. In the spring and the summer, you'll see the mason bee, the bumblebee. This is the bumblebee here. This is the mason bee here. You'll have the sweat bees coming out. I can't read the fine print, but this could be a sweat bee. Oh, here's the sweat bees up here. Carpenter bee, the wool carder bee, which I love the wool carder bees. They're so cute. And then in the summer and the fall, you have a different group of bees coming out. You still have the bumbles. The leaf cutters are going to be out more later on. The digger bee, longhorn bee, the sweat bees are still around. The carpenter, the wool carder is still there. And I forgot to put squash bee on here, I just realized. So why are there so many? And the answer is back to that first slide I showed you, which is the various ecoregions that we have around the state. You have so many different temperatures, so the different water quantities. It changes into different plant species, and those plant species have evolved with different flower types. And so if you're a pollinator, then you need to be able to evolve. And if you've got a relationship going for 170 million years, you're going to change and evolve as you go along. So it's really just another example of the diversity in the state of Oregon. Utah has more native bees than we do, and then also California. I think California has about 1,300 species. So a diverse ecosystem gives you a diverse numbers and species of the different pollinators. Here's 2 different life cycles I thought I'd share with you. I mentioned that most of the native bees are solitary. This is a mason bee. This is actually an example of how the bees have their life cycle, even if they're not a mason bee. Like a leafcutter bee, it would be a similar life cycle, just at a different time of the year. So mason bees are spring bees. So in the springtime, the male and female will emerge from the nest from the mama the year before. They mate. She collects pollen and nectar. She collects that and puts it in the nest that she's created in a tunnel, maybe in a bee box if you're lucky that you bought, or maybe just in a crevice in a rock, or somewhere where she can fit maybe 5 to 8. So this is the pollen and the nectar that she collected, and here's the little egg. And then she puts mud in between the cells, the chambers, perhaps I should say that. And then after she lays maybe 30 of those in her 6-week life cycle, she dies. Never sees her babies. And so then the life cycle goes along, they turn into pupa, and then they actually turn into little adults, but they hibernate because it's cold outside. And so they're still hibernating in the early winter, and then somewhere around February, March, when it gets warm enough, they emerge and then they start all over again. And so, like I said, many of the other native bees that are solitary, which most of them are, they have a similar life cycle, but different times of the year, different places, different types of nesting. You'll hear me say this again, 70% of the bees nest in the ground. So different ecosystems require different ways of life cycles and lifestyles, if you will. And then this is the bumblebee, which is just really amazing. A bumblebee can be solitary and social at the same time. Well, not the same time, the same nest. Sorry, that was slightly misleading. So starting in the fall, and this might make more sense. So in the fall, after the male bees have been hatched and grow up, and they find their sweetie, and then the mated female will find a place to hibernate over winter. And then in the springtime, she's out looking for flowers. And that's where you come in. And then she starts laying her eggs. And then when her daughters, these are daughters first, they go out and they help their mama collect them more pollen and nectar, make these little honey cups. And she keeps laying eggs. And then hopefully she has a large brood. So a good bumblebee nest could have 100 babies. She could have 100 offspring, which is large for any of the native bees. And then later in the fall, she knows it's time to start laying male eggs. So the males hatch and start all over again. So the mated female lives 1 year. She doesn't live on longer than that, but she does have a complete year's life cycle. But her worker bees, her worker daughter bees, and her sons, they live a short period of time. They don't live through the whole year. So it's incredibly fascinating how the native bees evolved so differently here in this continent. So moving on, we have other pollinators. We have butterflies and moths. Here are a couple of the butterflies, a monarch. Hopefully everyone has seen a monarch. And then the swallowtail, which is more common, big, beautiful yellow butterfly. This is a monarch caterpillar, and most of you know that the monarch caterpillar could eat only milkweed. But I want to share with you that there are a number of other butterfly caterpillars who are very host specific as well. One example would be the fritillary butterflies, great spangled fritillary butterfly. They require violets as their baby food. No violets, no fritillary butterflies. Moths are also important pollinators. Most people don't even think about moths, right? I mean, you're asleep when most of them are out, unless you get lucky and you see this beautiful white line sphinx moth. I was lucky enough to take a photo of this lovely creature on my bee balm a couple years ago. And then this is a fairly nondescript moth that most of us see and don't think much about. If you do get this presentation, there's a link here. I listened to this, I don't know, 6 months ago. It's a pretty recent study coming out that moths might be as important as bees for even our food crops. There's a man over in the East Coast somewhere, I don't remember, and he's doing a study about the moths in orchards and other food crops. And so even moths that can be pests can also be pollinators, it's sounding like. So this is something that I think we're going to hear more about. So you can get a link to this if you get this presentation. So just thinking about these numbers, does anybody know which number goes with which is butterflies and which is moths? So you might think, of course, it's 10,000 butterfly species. Well, no, it isn't actually. We have almost 11,000 species of moths in North America and only about 775 species of butterflies. Kind of strange to think about that. So I think butterflies are actually day-flying moths, right? That's really what it is. And something that's so unique about the butterflies and the moths is that there actually needs to be two food sources to get the butterfly or the moth. You have to have the nectar for the butterfly, um, although you see this little asterisk here, and so you should know that some adults, butterflies or moths, they don't actually eat. Their purpose in life is to basically get mated and lay eggs, or to mate so that somebody else can lay eggs. So if you think about it from that aspect, it's the most important part of the life cycle really is the plants, because that's what feeds the babies, the caterpillars. We also have pollinating flies. These ones are not stinging or biting of humans. And with flies, you get a little extra bonus because sometimes the larva can be helpful in your garden. Maybe not if you're a monarch person. The tachinid fly, which I think are super cute, they do look a lot like houseflies, but if you pay attention to them, you can see them on the flowers, and they are obviously interested in that nectar. I think they're going for the nectar, not the pollen so much. And you can see how bristly they are. They just look different than houseflies. And if you're a monarch person, you may not like them so much because the larva they'll lay eggs rather, I'm sorry, in the larva of a monarch caterpillar. And then so much for that monarch caterpillar. Another double duty fly is the cute little bee fly. You may have seen them fly, and they're only about maybe this big, and they hover like a hummingbird, teeny tiny little hummingbird, and their proboscis always is out. It never goes back in. So you can tell it's not a butterfly, plus the eyes are so large, and plus the legs are just so tall and skinny. So this little bee fly, its eggs are also parasitizing. If they would be, I think, on mason bees. So if you have these, then maybe your mason bee population is pretty good. The hoverfly, most everybody has a hoverfly. They look like bees, bee mimic, but look how large the eyes are, how short the antenna, and again, the skinny legs, and they're called a hoverfly because they hover. And this is the tiny little larva that I have seen in my garden. You have to really look for it though, and it eats aphids. That's what these are. If this hungry larva is consuming aphids. So you definitely want hoverflies in your garden. So all three of these adults are pollinators. We have beetles, probably the oldest pollinator. They evolved back when plants weren't plants quite so much the way we know them. This is a longhorn flower beetle, and obviously the ubiquitous lady beetle. Hopefully you know what its larva looks like. This ugly little alligator thing is the baby of this one. So keep these in the garden. They are great aphid eaters as well. And then they change into a pupa and then they come back out again. And then this is a soldier beetle. This is a picture from my garden a couple years ago. I look at all those aphids. But the soldier beetle is moving in to hopefully get rid of all those. Although I don't think I have enough soldier beetles to deal with it. And it looks like this lady beetle right here is actually consuming an aphid. And then wasps. So I actually really like wasps. The yellow jackets are definitely a problem. We don't have enough space for people and wasps the way we live now. I took this photo of a bunch of wasps eating a grasshopper. Pretty cool. But they do, the yellow jackets definitely demand respect. The paper wasps, I keep meaning to have a slide about this and I keep forgetting to put it in there. The paper wasps look a lot like yellow jackets and they're pretty non-aggressive. So if you have those papery triangle shapes up in your eaves, those are paper wasps, not yellow jackets. And I encourage you to leave them. They are also going to provide a lot of food in the fall and winter for birds. The birds will come up and peck them out and eat them. Wasps in general, including yellow jackets, are great predators in the garden for the pests that you may not want. So if you can keep wasps, that would be great. They're not the best pollinator. You can tell that from the legs, how skinny they are. There's hardly any hair on them. But they do come to the flowers, so there may be incidental pollinators. They're coming there for the nectar, not the pollen. So they can pick it up and move it from tiny little flower to another tiny little flower. This is a sand wasp, a beautiful creature. It's a thin-waisted wasp. I took this in my garden. I think I took this photo. So wasps are really great. Wasps are very diverse. I wish I knew more about wasps. There's lots of them for a reason. If you can live with wasps, I hope you can. You'll find your garden in a better shape. And then lastly, the hummingbirds, not an insect quite so much, but also an important pollinator. Think about how many flowers in a day a hummingbird will visit, looking for that nectar, for that energy that she has to have to fly around. They also do eat insects for protein, like mosquitoes and aphids. Yay. Tubular flowers is usually what's said, but look at this. There's a hummingbird going for a sunflower, and there's actually a little article here if you want to read about that. I put this picture in here because for those of us who may have a spider aversion, we definitely need spiders for hummingbirds because they use spider silk as well as lichen and grasses for their nests. So just super sweet to see that beautiful photo. So here we go. If we hope to stem the losses of insect diversity and the services they provide, society must take steps at all levels to protect, restore, and enhance habitat for insects across landscapes, from wildlands to farmlands to urban cores. And since most of us live in urban cores, then I'm hoping that this will be helpful for you to think about things in maybe a little bit more larger scale. So what does make a pollinator garden? So here's our friend, the sweat bee on Oregon Sunshine. So you really already heard all of this, but I'm going to organize it a little bit more, and we're going to watch a couple of videos. If you're still with me, then you'll find some of these videos hopefully helpful as well. Here's another version of a tachinid fly, and here's a bumblebee. You can see the pollen and nectar really that she's collected. And this is a poppy, California poppy, a really important source for pollen in the spring and in the fall. The bumblebees that have just emerged, any of the native bees that have just emerged, and then also for the fall bees that are getting ready to hibernate, such as the bumblebee queen. So poppies are really great in the landscape. Really great year this year for poppies. I think this is supposed to be a lady beetle drinking liquid, or no, maybe it's eating an aphid. It's a funny picture, actually. I'm going to talk more about this ugly plant. This is a pearly everlasting, and it's an important lesson, I think. I'll talk about that in a second. Leaving the leaves, I'm sure you've heard that by now. A lot of insects and other creatures overwinter. This is the top of a ground nesting bee nest. This is the tumulus, where she's brought out the soil to dig her nest. This is not being eaten. This is not a pest that's eating or cutting, I should say, cutting this leaf. This is actually the sign of a leaf cutter bee in your neighborhood. This might be a tree in my yard, I'm not sure. But so each one of these are scientifically, if you will, calculated in the size and the cut, because she knows what size cavity she has. And so she has to cut these leaves in pieces, and then she's going to wrap them together, and that's going to be the casing for her pollen and nectar ball on which she's going to lay her eggs. So it ends up looking a little bit like egg rolls. So these these thin leaves like redbud or roses or lilacs, you'll often see this pattern, and then you should be happy. And then this is a picture I took somewhere, lots of little blue butterflies and then one brown one, and they're all puddling on, I think, goose poop or bird poop at least, getting the minerals. So these are all the things here that pollinators need. They need food, basically, just like we do. They need shelter, just like we do. 70% of the bees nest in the ground, 30% live in cavities, like we talked about the mason bee, the leaf litter. They need moisture either to consume directly or mud, and of course, they don't need pesticides. Um, so thinking about native plants, especially as food, here's some examples. This was one of my first caterpillars I discovered in our garden here, Pollinator Project Rogue Valley, when we planted a garden. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So you can see the little caterpillar was eating it. I was just so thrilled. There's a sweat bee on a Bolander sunflower, and here's some moth caterpillar on a coyote tobacco plant. I took this photo in December. The Idaho gumweed was still blooming. This is in Phoenix, so it's pretty hot. But these are empty seed heads. After it bloomed and the seeds formed, either the birds came and consumed them or they just fell on the ground. But these are the empty seed heads. So you can see how many flowers there were on this particular plant. In December, it's still blooming. And then this is a run-of-the-mill, I think it's a mammoth sunflower. You can see the birds eating the seeds. So here is that ugly plant again. This is a pearly everlasting, and I am with Pollinator Project Rogue Valley. I don't think I actually introduced myself very well at the beginning, I'm just realizing. And we were growing these plants for our plant sale, and one of our volunteers came in and said the pearlies don't look very good. So I went out and I found this. Ooh. So these are caterpillars of a butterfly, and you can see I think the little webbing, I guess is what you would call it. So they would overnight there. That maybe that's their little sleepy bag over during the night, and then they'll come out and eat the plant, which is obviously what they need. This video shows you how many there were and how terrible the plants look. Pearly everlastings are perennials, and this was a lot of caterpillars. We ended up releasing 50 American butterflies. This is 2 summers ago. And so we didn't sell many plants, let's put it that way. But I was really super happy with the outcome of the little project there. And here's a picture of an American lady butterfly that we released. So without the pearly everlastings, we wouldn't have had those. Bees also nest in crevices and safe places, as well as the other creatures. I already mentioned leave the leaves. This is a picture of the American lady chrysalis that was in one of those photos, and it's about that big, which is maybe an inch. And then this is a picture here of the top of I don't know, raspberry cane or some sort of hollow stemmed plant in the fall. And the small carpenter bee mama would have pulled all this pith out, the dry insides. And then she would have been laying her eggs that would have formed the nest. Bees also nest in the ground, as I mentioned, 70% of the species. This is that top of let's call it a mining bee. And then this is an example of what it might look like inside. So each one of these are individual egg cavities. And like the mason bee, she will never see her babies, and then these will emerge depending on when the mama was laying the eggs. This is a video that I took up on Mount Ashland somewhere a couple years ago, and this was a sandy bank, hardly any vegetation on it. And these are solitary bees as well, but they congregate. So this is a digger bee, a relatively common bee. I mean, if you start paying attention to the bee species, you'll see how it's sort of gray with stripes and hairy legs, about the size of a honeybee, but chunkier. And they were just going to town. There must have been, I don't know, there could have been 100 of them all on this bank. It was really super cool. So think native, many reasons to do so, not just the insects, but you're helping to preserve the regional biological heritage of this amazing place. I took this photo up at Mount Ashland, and this is just off beside the road. I'm just walking on the road, and looks like a garden to me. So these are some important native plants: coyote mint, yarrow, I think it's sulfur flower buckwheat. There might be something else in there I'm not seeing. Oh, some grasses. So generally they require less maintenance, probably not fertilizer most of the time. If you're not familiar with Dr. Doug Tallamy, I would recommend that you look him up. There'll be a list of resources at the end, so there's at least one link. And probably Bringing Nature Home is one of the reasons I'm sitting here talking to you today. It's a great book. One of the big takeaways, I read that, I don't know, 15 years ago now, probably. One of the big takeaways of that book was he is from Delaware, and he worked with his grad student to find out how many species of organisms there are on different tree species. And so the ginkgo tree in his neighbor's yard produced one species of some non-native insect. I don't remember what it was. But the native oaks for that area of the country, he could document 532 species, which is mind-boggling to me. But if you think about all the soil organisms, and then in the trunks, the branches, the leaves up in the air, and what the connection, the web of life, if you will, must be around that oak. And so this would be true. The oak is a keystone species. He has another book out now. It came out last year, I think, called The Nature of Oaks. So look for that, and you can learn more about oak trees. He's from back east, so the species don't necessarily correspond to where we are, but the concept is the same. And he says that insect diversity decreases in landscapes with non-native plants. So if you can aim for 60% of native species, then you're doing pretty good. This is another finding of Dr. Doug Tallamy. It's kind of a funny way to say this, but when you exceed 30% of the plant biomass in your yard as woody non-natives, so if you say that if you have more than 30% of woody non-natives in your yard, I think is what that's saying, then the chickadee population becomes unsustainable. Why? Because there aren't enough caterpillars. So this was a meme that came out somewhere along that time, that a single pair of breeding chickadees must catch 7,500 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young, which is maybe 4 babies. When I saw that, I'm thinking, I don't think I have 7,500 caterpillars in my yard. We do have chickadees in our yard, though, so I guess they're getting something to eat. So if you want to watch this video when you get the presentation, it's a sweet video of mom and daddy feeding their babies. So just think about that, how much depends on caterpillars, which is dependent upon native species of plants. And of course, if you want insects in your yard, even the bad ones, you certainly don't want to use neonicotinoids because they travel through the food chain. Neonicotinoids are a systemic class of pesticides. So you have pesticides, And then you have herbicides like Roundup, you have insecticides like neonicotinoids, you can have fungicides, rodenticides, etc.cides. Um, and so the neonicotinoids are insecticides. They're systematic. Systemic, not systematic. Maybe they are that too, but they're systemic. So that means that the entire plant is toxic. Think about it. That's how you kill aphids that are eating your roses, right? The rose becomes toxic, so the aphid dies. Well, the problem with this little calculation is the fact that the pollen and the nectar are also toxic. So when you have creatures such as butterflies or bees consuming pollen and or nectar, it's going to impact them as well. The neonicotinoid has a long residual. It really cannot be washed off. People use it in their garden as a spray, a soil drench around the plant. You can inject it into a tree. I've seen that happen in Ashland, where you have a red maple planted in a skinny little strip along the street. Red maples need a lot of water. They're not native. So they're planted in the wrong place. And then it gets aphids, and then they inject it to kill the aphids. It seems like they should either plant a different tree or something. But anyway, just a comment. So I will also point out that neonicotinoids are also used on people crops. So it can be grown on used on tomatoes or squash. So if you're not eating organic, you could definitely also be eating neonicotinoids. When I was doing a lot of research on neonics, I found some of these um, results in the landscape. So the bee sperm count can be decreased, birds can be disoriented. Look that up. It's a very sad article. They found it in hummingbird urine. So there's lots of reasons to not use these blue bottles. And then Roundup or glyphosate can also impact pollinators. There was a study that came out recently, or not recently, but a couple years ago, about how honeybees are disoriented when Roundup is used at a field level, at a normal field level. You will not find, one last point for the neonicotinoids, I forgot to mention, you will not find this word on the bottle because, like I said, it's a class. So if you go and pick up a bottle, what you're looking for is probably this word. The imidacloprid is the most common neonicotinoid. These others are also used, but more for like really heavy duty stuff. So it's the imidacloprid that you really want to make sure you avoid. And neonicotinoids are water soluble, so they get into our waterways. And if you are not aware, fish eat insects. For those of you who might have known Gordon Jones when he was still at Extension, he did a presentation a year or so ago, and we have neonicotinoids in our waterways here in Jackson County. So if you're interested in that, you can let me know, and I can give you information about that particular study. So let's move away from that for the rest of the talk. We're done with all that sad news. So let's think like a pollinator. So what that means is what you want to see in your landscape, in your ecosystem where you live as a pollinator. You want to see lots of choices, trees to ground covers. You want flowers blooming from spring to fall. You want lots of things to eat. You want places to live. You want to be able to travel. So, having garden after garden after garden is going to be really important for the recovery of our pollinator species. And then as people, we need to rethink the aesthetics and what is a pollinator garden? What is a garden? Thinking about the ecosystem. So we've touched on this already, but if you're designing for pollinators, then you're going to be looking at the bloom time. You're going to think about where the creatures can live. This is a diagram that Tina Beaver, who I work with a good bit, she put this together for somebody's garden. So it shows you what the different plant species are and when they bloom and even what color they are. So you can sort of get this sense as to how that garden is going to look. Here's the leafcutter bees again, a little bit better picture. And the last thing I'm going to add to this slide is just, watch and learn as you start on your journey. Pay attention, look at things up close. It's amazing how much there is out there. So here are a couple, as I end this presentation, here are a couple of, I think, really awesome native plants that are going to, I think, both feed your sense of aesthetics and then also feed the pollinators in different ways. So you have the red flowering currant, majestic oak trees. Even if they're not this big, an oak tree is still going to serve its purpose. Vine maple, there's various varieties of ceanothus. They're blooming right now, and man, they are just absolutely gorgeous. Some of the perennials, sulfur flower buckwheat, they should be flowering now if you have any. Amazing host plant for butterflies. The California fuchsia, late blooming, just stunning in the landscape. The lupins, there's perennials, and there's also annuals. I'll show you in a minute. The asters are just excellent for the fall blooming. Some of the annuals, here's the California poppy again. This is an annual lupin. This is the bluegilia, a short-lived annual, but they're just gorgeous. My favorite tarweed again. And even grasses are important for the landscape. Many of our native bunch grasses serve as host plants for butterflies, the caterpillars, of course. So skipper butterflies, I think, are one of the fescues, I think. I could be misremembering. This is a sweet perennial plant that can be used as a ground cover, also really great for containers. The Pollinators facilia, California strawberry, you're probably familiar with that. And then even a sword fern can be used as a ground cover. There is a moth that depends on this as a host plant, which is interesting to think about. So I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm going to show you a story here. This is my pollinator Project Rogue Valley hat. When we moved into this building right there in Phoenix, this is a picture from April 2019, thanks to Google. And you can see 100% non-native garden. And I thought I'd add that this could be Georgia. These plants are extremely common in Georgia. The two that you saw there are the golden euonymus and the heavenly bamboo nandina, both from China, Japan. And nothing eats them here because I'm sure something eats them in their native countries, but that's not here. So they're not serving a lot of purpose in our landscape. Now, maybe the flowers in the springtime are visited by honeybees. And if some of you have read anything about the nandina, you might have heard that cedar waxwings might come through and gorge on the berries, and it can actually be poisonous to them. I don't know if it happens as much here as in other parts of the country, but it is something to think about. So I think the big point of this is these plants are not indigenous to here. They could be anywhere, and they're not really functional in our landscape, which is what we're trying to get to. So by 2021, we had removed all of those plants, and this is what it looked like. And I want to show you that there's a mugo pine here that is not native. And this is empty because the fire had come through. So this is 2021. The fire had come through. You can see the fire scar here. And the trees actually were impacted. The trees actually look worse than this now. But so this was another opportunity to do something to expand the native plant garden. So here in 2021, we have 31 native species in this maybe 100 square feet space. And by 2023, sorry, there it is, we now had 51 native species. And if you see here, here's the fire scar still, but this is started to be planted out. It's hard to tell from this picture, but it's there behind the tree, and the mugo pine is gone. So this is where the mugo pine was. And then this is what it looked like also in May of 2023. And then this, I was going to actually replace that with a picture this morning. I forgot. But this was about 2 weeks ago, and it's a cooler spring, so things haven't bloomed out quite so much. But we now have 52 perennial species in the space. I just added another one recently, and probably about 8 annuals. I lose track. But so in that time frame, these are just what 1% of the pollinators that I've been able to see, which we would not have seen if it had stayed the 100% non-native garden. So I think this is either a leaf, I think this is a leaf cutter because it looks like I can see her scopa right there, which is the pollen collecting hairs on her belly. And this is the gray streak, gray hair streak butterfly. And this is a moth of some the caterpillar of some moth species on the tarweed. This is a Nevada butterfly. I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. Nevada bumblebee queen. She's probably about that big. The fact that I was able to get that photo is amazing. This is a little Clarkia flower, so you can see how large she is. And this is 2 native bee species on the Idaho gumweed, and a hoverfly on the Rocky Mountain bee plant. So here's my suggestion to you that we can change our world. And we're going from this side of the picture. Ooh, lots of bugs and caterpillars are eating your leaves. And then this man says, yeah, that's exactly what I want. So if you have a pollinator garden, I invite you to get on the Rogue Buzzway map. This is the fire perimeter. And so it will be super great, especially to see how things are being filled in. You can click on here on the link if you get this presentation, or you can just go to our website, Pollinator Project Rogue Valley website, and here are some other links. Lynn Kunstman, who's a major native plant person with Master Gardeners, did this presentation a couple years ago. Here's a link to Doug Tallamy that I had mentioned earlier. This is a great link to Oregon State landscape plants. The Xerces Society, of course, is the premier pollinator organization in the country. And here are some more links. Master Gardener's website, Pollinator Project Rogue Valley website. We have resource lists and some events and classes coming up. There's the Rogue Buzzway. And I'm going to end with this lovely photo. I was taking this picture at my house of 2 wasps, I think, mating. And when I looked at the photo later, I see that I was able to pick up a bee flying past it. This is blossom inflorescence of a ceanothus, a deer brush, one of the beautiful species of native ceanothus in this area. And if anyone has a question that you'd like to see here. Yeah. Lauren is asking about the California pipevine. Is that good for planting in Southern Oregon? Yes. Well, I don't know enough. I know that Lynn Kunzman, who I just mentioned, who's a big native plant person, she is growing the pipevine. It's the only host plant for the pipevine swallowtail. I think that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's a good thing to plant or not. Things are moving up from California for many reasons because, it's getting hotter and drier if you haven't noticed. I've seen the pipevine grow. I'm not sure I want it in my garden because it's pretty prolific. So I'm not going to say yes or no. Will the pipevine swallowtail come up here? There was a sighting in the Applegate last year. So I don't really have an answer. I know that people are. It's a beautiful plant. It's an amazingly beautiful butterfly. Amazingly beautiful. I don't know. That's a good question. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Pete. Are bats pollinators? I didn't even talk about that. I should have that in my presentation. Bats are pollinators. Bats are not pollinators to this area of the country. We have 15 species of bats here in Oregon, and all of them are insect eaters. So if you are insect eaters, you don't visit flowers very often because the pollen and or the nectar is not going to attract you. So you would not be going to that flower um, unless you just happen to dive bomb an insect that's on it, right? So yeah, bats are wonderful creatures. I love bats. We need more bats. Bats have issues as well, but they are not going to fall into this particular presentation because they're not a pollinator. Other questions or thoughts?
Right,
Ooh.
I think we might be wrapping up on questions. So I'm going to say thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to do these. Thank you, Colette and Christina. Keep an eye out for future programs. This is recorded and it will also be available on our YouTube channel within the next few weeks. And if you would like access to the presentation, feel free to email us at information@jcls.org, and I would be happy to pass on Christina's slides, contact information, if you're okay with it, that sort of
Sure,
thing as well for anyone that wants or has additional questions.
that's
So with
great.
that, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and say have a great rest of your day, everybody.